Welcome! This is an Excel tutorial for Chem 242 Lab 1. This has been especially designed for people who have very little Excel experience, so if you do know how to do this already, you don't need to watch the video. Okay, so let's say that after being in lab, you collect this data from your measuring spoons. If you haven't used Excel before, this first part is just going to be to help familiarize you with the way it's laid out. So there are a whole bunch of these little boxes that we call cells. And you can see that each row of cells has a number. Each column of cells has a letter. Sometimes there are alternative setups where each row of cells has a number and each column of cells has a number. That can make things a little more complicated, I find, but let's not worry about that right now. This is a pretty basic task that we're doing here. So the first thing you need to do is you need to enter your data. And it helps to have nice readable headings for your columns. So I'm just going to duplicate the headings that are in the table in your lab notebook. So we have the type of measurement, which trial number for that measurement, and then the fraction of a teaspoon. And then the mass in grams. Now you'll notice that because the fraction of a teaspoon is a really long phrase, it kind of gets cut off. And if you're fine with keeping it cut off, that's fine. Just leave it like that. But if you want to see all of it, you can actually, up at the top here, where the column letters are, you can click on a column. You have to click on the column first. And then when you go to the dividing line, you'll see this little arrow thing. And then you can just slide it. Now, I'm going to make these bold, and I just basically highlighted them and used Control B, and so that just made it all bold. You can also just go up here to make it bold. So now I'm going to go and enter the data. So we have 1 tablespoon, and we have trials 1, 2, and 3 for 1 tablespoon, and then we have 1 teaspoon, 1, 2, and 3. We have our half teaspoon and trials 1, 2, and 3 for that. And then we have our quarter teaspoon, trials 1, 2, and 3. So the fraction of the teaspoons, those are actually given in the table, but I'm just going to talk you through where those numbers came from. So 1 teaspoon is 1 teaspoon. So that's the fraction. Half a teaspoon is 1/2. So we call this fraction of teaspoon, but it's really a decimal, right? So that's 0.5. And then a quarter teaspoon is 0.25. So that's pretty straightforward. Now, a tablespoon, it's not a fraction of a teaspoon, so I don't know why we have that in our protocol, but 1 tablespoon is defined as 3 teaspoons, so we're just going to put 3 here. Now, a teaspoon of water should be a given mass, a known mass. So theoretically, if you multiply that fraction of a teaspoon by whatever the mass of a teaspoon of water should be, you should end up with the appropriate mass. Now, that's not what we're doing here. What we're doing here is we're putting the actual measured mass that I showed you earlier. So I'm just putting in this data that I showed you earlier. So the next thing you need to do is make a scatter plot. So what you want to do is you want to plot your fraction of a teaspoon on the x-axis and the mass on the y-axis. So there's 2 ways to do this, and I'll show you both of them. The first one is the way that most people are comfortable with, and so I'm going to show you that one first, and then I will show you the other way. We're just going to highlight these 2 things that we want to graph. We're going to go to the Insert tab, and then you're going to find the Graph button. So I'm doing this on a Mac, so it's slightly different. And I'm just going to click on the scatter plot. And I'm going to pick this one. You don't want to pick any of these options that have lines connecting them. You want one that's just points. Okay, so this is popping up and it says chart title. So you probably want to change that. You can just click that and say mass per teaspoon. Or something like that. Make up your own name. Now, I did not highlight the column headers. If I had, they probably would have ended up as axis titles. You always want to have axis titles. So in this case, our horizontal axis is our fraction of a teaspoon. And then our vertical axis is mass in grams. Okay, now I know you know what this is, but will you know what it is, let's say 15 weeks from now? That's why it's always good to have these labels, so other people who look at your lab notebook can interpret it, and also so you can interpret it, a couple months down the road. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a linear graph. So the way I usually do this is I click on one of the points. Don't double click. That's its own problem. But you see that when I single clicked, it just highlighted all of our points. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to Add Chart Element. I'm going to click here, and I'm going to find linear. Now, there's a couple of other ways. I know that when you're using Windows, you can also find that linear fit by clicking the button that's right up here on a graph. I don't have that on the Mac. But now what you want to do is you want to get the r squared in the equation. There's a couple of different ways you can do that. You can just click on the trend line, not one of the points on this linear fit, but actually the line. And then when you go over here, you can format it. So if you want to change the color or something, I don't know why you would do that, but you could do that, over here if you want an orange line. That's colors. You want to go over to this thing that looks like a bar graph. And here you have your options. And so you can see that over here we have our display the equation on the chart and display the r squared value on the chart. Now, I'm just going to slide this over here, and I like to make that a little bigger if I'm old and I have old eyes, but you can make it more readable if you want. I highly recommend playing around with the options and just to see, like what makes it more readable when you print this out and put it in your lab notebook. What's going to make it easiest for you to read. Okay, so that's the first way to make a graph, is basically highlighting things and going to the chart. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to make the same chart, I'm going to make it a completely different way. So I'm just going to start up here by the XY scatter plot, and I'm going to select this option again. You can see that it's completely blank because it doesn't know what it's making a graph of. So now I'm going to tell it. So I'm going to select the data. And we want to make a series of data, so let's add a series. You can give it a name if you want. I'm not going to. So it's asking for X values, and you can actually type this in if you know the cells you want, but I'm just going to click on this little thing to the side, and then I can just click and drag to highlight the X values. Hit Enter. Now we'll do our Y values. Click and drag. And so you can see that I've made exactly the same graph. Now, why would you do it this way? It seems a little more difficult. Well, the answer is sometimes you can't just highlight this area. Sometimes you'll have one column here and one column, way over here. and you cannot click and drag and get all of it. So the second way is the way you're going to do it when you have more complicated data sets, and you'll definitely see that happening later in this course. So anyway, now you have a chart, you have a finished chart, you have the equation for your line, you have the r squared. And so this has been a practice. Your next lab is going to have a similar graph, and then we're going to do a more complicated graph about a week after that.